media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and thought I'd start off by mentioning some things that we will get to in the second hour. One of those has to do with the fact that there were at least 4 Republicans in the House of Representatives that signed the discharge petition, so there will be a vote on the enhanced subsidies for the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare, so we will get to that. We already had planned a very good piece that was put together on the Republicans' suggestion for a better health care plan, so we will certainly cover some of that in the next hour. Probably we'll cover it again on Friday when Dr. Merrill Matthews, who's an expert on this issue of health care policy, will join us, so we'll get into that. Of course, we also have a few other comments that have come from other columnists about the issue of the attack of Jewish people in Australia and what that might mean and the implications for the future. And before we're all through, of course, Susie Wiles, Chief of Staff for the Trump administration, did an interview with Vanity Fair. There have been all sorts of questions about that, and so, of course, we will cover those issues along the way. So quite a bit to cover in the second hour, but we thought we would start off first with an interview with Aimee Byrd, who's been with us before. Matter of fact, last year, might remember, we talked about her book, The Hope in Our Scars. She's a speaker, writer, blogger, podcaster, former coffee shop owner as well. Her articles have appeared in First Things, Table Talk. She's been interviewed and quoted in such things as Christianity Today and The Atlantic. But we're going to talk about saving faith, finding myself, God, and another outside a defaced church. So what about faces and how to think about that from a biblical point of view? So, Aimee, welcome back to Point of View.
It's good to be back. Thanks for having me.
When we talk about faith, face, I don't know why I keep saying that, face, I think of C.S. Lewis, because the two relate very much. Yes. C.S. Lewis, of course, Till We Have Faces, and really that's a sense in which when we talk about our own Christian faith, we talk about face, and even, of course, the face of Jesus. We're going to get into the reflected face, the fractured face, the blessed face, the naked face, and maturing face, but those are important principles that really run all the way through your book, don't they?
Yes, as a matter of fact, C.S. Lewis's book, his novel, Till We Have Faces, really inspired this book. And that whole last scene when Orwell had been, putting together her journal of arguments against the gods. And she really had built up her own self-righteousness of what she thought was good and that she was living that life. And she blamed God for all of the horrible things that she saw as they were in her life. And when she finally, at the end of her life, has this vision and this chance to be before the gods and read her book of complaints, she realizes, and she's naked, and the veil that she normally wore to cover her ugliness was stripped away. And this is a whole retelling of Cupid and Psyche, but she begins to read from her journal. They tell her to read her complaint. And all of a sudden, her journal seems a lot smaller than she remembered. And she opens it up, and the words look kind of scratched in there in anger, like scribbly. And nevertheless, she begins to read it and read it and read it. And she realizes that she's kind of reading the same thing over and over and over and over again. And the gods ask her, does she have her answer? And she answers yes, because she realizes, how could she expect the gods to answer her until she has a face?
So good.
And that's when she just realized she's been putting on a persona of what she thought was good her whole life. And now she's before actual goodness in her nakedness.
And again, what I think is so interesting is how this matches even with our conversation yesterday, because we were talking about abuse. In your case, it's been more spiritual abuse. That one's more verbal and physical abuse, but it's all the same. And what I think is so interesting is Dan Allender, who's been on the program with us many times, and I've interviewed him not only on this program, but other radio programs I've done in the past, said, no one has seen their face with innocence and wonder. We bear bias fueled by industries of shame. We are told we need something other than what we see to be loved. Aimee uses words as a mirror to see ourselves as God sees us in the gaze of his delight. This brilliant, compelling, and transformative book is a vision of what it will be like to be fully captured by the face of God. And so, in some respects, we see through a mirror darkly, and we don't see ourselves effectively, even though we look in a mirror, don't we?
Correct. And I make the argument that in the book that our faces serve as mirrors to one another, because we really can't see our own face. And we come into the world looking, longing for a delightful gaze so that we know that we matter. And we do that our whole lives. And, ultimately we're longing for God's face to gaze into our face and to be pleased with us. And I believe that we have that opportunity now as bearers of his image, as, temples of the Holy Spirit, to be able to give that face to others. And then when you see that delight and that benediction, then you find something true about yourself in that. So our faces serve as a mirror in that way, too.
Well, and one of the individuals you quote is Kurt Thompson, who we've had on the program, but you also quote Richard Rohr, who uses this idea that basically the faces of others are mirrors, even as we are seeking the divine face. Can you kind of fill that out for us for a moment?
Right. So as I was saying, we're looking for that delight. We want to be delighted in. However, the face can also completely undo us. I know my husband's told me before, well, it's not so much the words that you just said, but your look on your face of total disgust has just torn me apart, Yes. And we can do that with our faces. And I think we work so hard to keep this mask up of what we think people, want from us, what we think is what a good Christian is even. And we go to church with these faces, but we get cracks in that face when things don't go our way. Or even when we're met with actual wonder and awe, like a child. And so I believe that we can help one another in this way to draw out our real face and maybe drop some of that mask.
I think so. I need to take a break. When I come back, though, I want to talk about mirrors, because you talk about the mirror of eternity. Of course, we talk about dark mirrors or black mirrors, things of that nature. I think that's very important as well. It's all part of the first section that gets into the reflected face. Then we'll talk about the fractured face and the blessed face and many others. All part of a book published by Zondervan, a Zondervan Reflective Saving Face, Finding Myself, God, and One Another Outside a Defaced Church. And again, if you are interested in learning a little bit more about Aimee Byrd, of course, we have all sorts of information about her. You might want to check out the previous interview that we've done with her, because that was certainly one that people have benefited from. But if you go to Aimee Byrd, and that's spelled A-I-M-E-E, Byrd with a Y. But again, don't have to remember that, because it's all right there on the website. You'll find out more about the book there, as well as others. If you'd like to join her conversation, like to know about some of her other books, if you'd like to maybe schedule her to come and speak or something of that nature, we have all of that available on the website at pointofview.net. This is a book that has come out this year, and I think it is a good parallel and follow-up on the previous book that we talked about with her, which was The Hope in Our Scars. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Glenn Beck has been writing about a coming reset in his books, The Great Reset and Dark Future. Now he's been talking about an economic reset that will trigger a cultural and political reset. He explains that every debt-based system will end in one of three ways. The country will inflate the money so they can pay off the debt. This is what the German Weimar Republic did. This is what Rome did. The second is a hard default that usually leads to political upheaval. This is what Russia did in 1917. This is what Argentina has done numerous times. The third comes usually after a war that leads to a new monetary order. After World War II, we had the Bretton Woods Conference that made the U.S. dollar the reserve currency of the world. Something is different this time. He says Rome collapsed by itself. France collapsed alone. Weimar collapsed by itself. Britain declined while America rose. This time the collapse won't be national or regional, it will be global. All the major nations are sinking in the debt cycle. Why is this happening? Lynn Alden writes about this in Broken Money, and Lawrence Lepard writes about the big print that is coming. The economy is broken because the money is broken. What will be the future? We can gain some insight from billionaire and hedge fund manager Ray Dalio, who has written about the changing world order and how countries go broke. We will likely face turmoil before a new world order arises from the ashes of countries that naively thought that you could keep borrowing your way to prosperity. This is a time for Christians to point the way to sound financial and biblical principles. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view on chemical abortion, go to viewpoints.info/chemical abortion. Viewpoints.info/chemical abortion. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Aimee Byrd with us today as we talk about her book, Saving Face, Finding Myself, God, and One Another Outside of a Defaced Church, published by Zondervan. Might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have links so that you can find it there as well, and certainly find your way to her website. But Aimee, let's talk about mirrors, because we have first mirrors, negative mirrors, black mirrors, even mirrors that are past, present, and eternal. So in some respects, we're going to talk about a face. We also have to talk about the mirrors, don't we?
Yeah, I introduced the concept of the face as a mirror, which I've already spoken a little bit about. But Claire of Assisi said, place your mind before the mirror of eternity. And she talked about Christ's face as a mirror. And she calls him the mirror without blemish. So, God was given a face in Jesus Christ. And in him and through his ministry and his word, we are faced with our own faces. And his face and his word and the ministry to us is like a mirror that shows us. It shows us our blemishes, but it also shows us what Christ sees in us when he sees us. And that is what we long to behold in the beatific vision, in the time when he returns. We long to see God in Jesus Christ delighting in us, and through his face, seeing the way that he sees us and us becoming that.
And again, we will see each other face to face. And it's something that you don't tend to think about because we tend to think of God in an ethereal way, but we have the incarnation. What an appropriate time to talk about right now, the incarnation and all of that. So you do talk about that in the positive sense, but you also talk about this idea of what you call mirror neurons, and they're quoting 1 Corinthians 15, bad company corrupts good character, or even the idea of Black Mirror, which is actually one of these Netflix shows, because in some respects, that's the other aspect. That's the other side of the coin, if you will.
Right, like there's a darkness to it as well. The Black Mirror show kind of is kind of like the netherworld of the mirror, right? And it kind of gives you a hat tip too, like if you were staring at your device, at your screen before it lights up, it's kind of a reflection of what's going on in our psyches and our souls. And so what do we find in that little flash? And whole worlds are held in these small screens that we have. But in that show, we see kind of a dystopia of ourselves. And so I talk a little bit how our dreams can function in that way too. But, all the shadow things that we kind of stuff down that we don't want other people to see, or that we don't want to see in our own selves. We're really busy polishing our face for everyone to see, our whole persona for everyone to see. And we want to be that. So we kind of shove those things down and down and down. And poet Robert Bly talks about it as kind of the long black bag we carry behind us. That I think there comes a time in your life when you're disrupted and you realize that there's many holes in what you believe and who you think you are and the meaning that you're searching for. And you do find that your faces are fractured, and you got to look in that bag and start pulling some of those things out. So I do that in my book. I bring up little snippets of memories throughout my life. Dan Allender kind of referred to the book as a theological memoir because I think it's very personal for us as we grow in sanctification.
I thought it was interesting that your psychology professor wanted you to remember the very first memory that you had, and I thought, gosh, I was trying to do that myself, but we won't get into me. We'll get into yours. But there's another part of this that, of course, people know you for, and that is you have a section called the Black Mirror Church, and there is a situation which we are well aware of now, but I thought almost immediately in the next chapter, you then talk about something that I've preached on and taught many times in 1 Samuel 2, and that is you have Eli, the great priest, but then you have the sons who were sleeping with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. And, of course, one thing I appreciate about the Bible is it doesn't cover over, it doesn't sugarcoat, it doesn't turn a blind eye, whatever metaphor you want to use, to evil and to sin. And in some respects, that's something as well, that the mirror reveals the things that you've experienced and many others have as well. Is that fair?
Yes, it is. And it's hard to speak about, right? Because we want the church to have a good PR. we feel like we are the public relations for Christ, and that we need to make the church full of shiny, happy people so the world around us will think that, okay, well, if you accept Christ in your life, if you're a Christ follower, that your life is going to be wonderful. And that's not the way it is. And there's actually a lot of corruption even within the church. And we're told it's going to be like that. And we see in Scripture, Scripture is such proof for us that Christ doesn't need smiley, happy people to testify for him. We see it in the raw, right? It isn't, people's lives aren't wrapped up in beautiful bows and they live happily ever after. And in these stories in Scripture, they're a mess, actually. Until they encounter God, there's something profound that happens there. It doesn't take away all that they've been through, though, but it meets in Christ. It meets in Christ, and it transforms. So I just feel like this is our chance to be more honest as a church. And in that section where I'm talking about the bronze basin in the laver of the tabernacle, it's made from the women's mirrors. And so as Eli, and as they're washing to go into the tabernacle, there's a mirror there. And what should that be showing them?
That's amazing. And again, some of this I'd never really picked up until reading your piece. But again, we could camp out all day there, but I thought we'd at least go to part 2, and that is the idea of the fractured face. And, of course, one of the things that I thought was very significant is the importance of a good name, and which you get into that. And in some respects, we can look at corrupt institutions, but the mirror causes us to look back on our own face and our own life and how we live out the Christian life, because ultimately the church is the body of believers, is it not?
It is, and I had to do that myself. I've been through some pretty significant spiritual abuse by leaders in my denomination, and it was very public and traumatizing, frankly. But and it's easy for me to say, I'm the victim of this horrible abuse, and it's all them. They're the bad people. I'm the good person here. But it's more complex than that. And I needed to take this moment in my life to look at myself as well, and how I got all wrapped up in a version of sanctification that isn't quite, whole. And, I thought truth was such a doctrinal matter, and that it was about certainty. And I made truth objective and dehumanized. That's what attracted me to that denomination, I believe. And I learned that I was looking at the outside of things, and that we need to be made ready for reality and for truth, and that God is preparing us for the ultimate blessing of seeing his face in Christ. And so he gives us this whole life help one another to uncover our faces and develop our taste for truth. And so, yeah, in that chapter, I go back to a memory of where I really harmed, my best girlfriend. And I, with my own self-righteousness and my own version of the good me, and that she wasn't living up to that in her life. It's just terrible. It was really hard to write, but man, was it healing. And it's been very healing for our friendship now, to be able to send her that chapter and ask if I portrayed it correctly, and to be able to talk about these things and restore them. And so it really made me see that, man, if we can admit our harm that we do, and if we could truly go and ask for repair, that is so beautiful. That is such a beautiful thing. And how many times do we all miss the opportunity for repair?
Yes.
Because we won't look. We won't look.
Yeah. To seek forgiveness and to give forgiveness, which again was one of the themes that surfaced yesterday. But we need to take a break. When we come back, we're going to focus on the blessed face. And that's where God shows us his face. And you might even turn with us to Numbers chapter 6. May the Lord bless you and protect you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord look with favor on you and give you peace. And of course, you've heard that sometimes at the end of a worship service, a benediction. But what about that idea of a face, of God showing his face? And then we'll get into some other aspects of this book called Saving Face, Finding Myself, God, and One Another Outside of a Defaced Church. Aimee Byrd with us. If you would like to know more about her, we have, of course, a link to her website, a link to her social media, also a link to her book. So all sorts of resources you might want to check out during the break. And we will come back right after these important messages.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Aimee Byrd as we talk about her book, Saving Face, Finding Myself, God, and One Another Outside a Defaced Church, published by Zondervan. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have information about her and the book on our website at pointofview.net. But Aimee, I closed that last segment by reading from Numbers 6, and that is a benediction which you say you remember hearing from a very young age, and even later on going and talking about being in the Southern Baptist Church and being baptized. And this is something that maybe didn't have a great deal of punch because you say it all the time, you hear it all the time, and then all of a sudden you're not hearing it and you begin to realize that you missed it. And I thought this is just a perfect place to enter into this whole section about God showing His face and the Lord making His face shine upon you.
Yeah, so Yeah, I grew up in a church that said that as the benediction. The pastor said that as our benediction at the end of every service. And the church that I've been going to in much of my adult life, we had a benediction. It wasn't always that one, though. But yeah, as a child, I didn't think very much of it at all. It was just like kind of the closer. I knew to hold still, though, because you're getting a blessing from God in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And then as an adult, I began thinking of the benediction more, of just how we are sent out into into the world with this blessing of God. And then as we started visiting churches, as we were looking for a new church home, we found a lack of liturgy in a lot of the churches, and so there was no benediction. And that made me realize how much I missed that and how I longed really for that blessing to be sent out with. And then as I was going back to the one from Numbers 6:24, I believe, where it says, "The Lord bless you and keep you.
Mm-hmm.
The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace." And I just thought, what does that mean? For the Lord to make his face shine upon you. And is that something that we are sent out with then now, or is this something that we long for when he returns? And I think it's a little of both. We do long for it, but I believe that when we walk out with this benediction, this blessing, there's also a call there for us to be that face of God shining upon others, and so that they can receive it, because we are an extension of his face. So I found that to be quite a holy calling. And Emmanuel Levinas, a French philosopher, he talks about this idea of the naked face. And he says, when you can look past the visage of a face, past that masked story that it tells, to see the naked face, that's when we see what God sees. But it's so vulnerable, right? So he talks about the power and the authority in the naked face, because really we could just destroy it in its vulnerability if we wanted to. We hold that. And so he says the naked face gives the command, "Thou shalt not kill." And so that's a great responsibility to bear this goodness, to bless that person, to say, "It is good that you are here. I see you in all your otherness. And in fact, your otherness reveals me in all my own strangeness." And that is good. But, I also want to flip that around and say, well, it's not just an admonition, "Thou shalt not kill," but it is the command to love our neighbor as ourself. And that's why I wholly agree with the title of the book where I was reading this, which is called "Is It Righteous to Be?" And which Levinas concludes that, yes, it is righteous to be. What a philosophical question. But because our own faces call one another to love. And there's no greater blessing than that. So I feel like the Lord make his face shine upon you is what we are called to here now for each other.
And as you were just talking about a minute ago, because I want to get back to the naked face, just as you said in passing, the Lord's face shine upon you. It's now, but it's future. It's reminiscent to our conversation yesterday, to use a real complex term, inaugurated eschatology. Yes, the kingdom is here, but it is yet to be fulfilled in the future. If you take that same concept of the fact of the kingdom is now, but it is going to be in its full form later, there's a sense in which God actually does have his face shine upon you now, but it will be full-faced, if you will, when we go to meet him ultimately in heaven or here in the next kingdom. So I think there's a way to look at that. Let me come back to this idea that you even talk about being bare-faced, because it does seem to me that that's one of the points that you make in the section there on the naked face, is that we really, in some respects, want transparency. Next hour, I'm going to be talking quite a bit about transparency that we need in government, and some people are more transparent than others. But with that transparency comes sometimes a fair amount of bluntness, but also a very significant risk. And so most of us walk around with one of those actors' masks that they had in the Greek tragedies and others, in which we do have our public face and our private face. But if we believe in integrity, you should be the same in private as you are in public. But that's a high risk, isn't it?
Yes. And, I talk about this whole concept of finding our face is really about what you're saying, integrity or integration. It's about becoming whole in our longings, our emotions, our faith, knowledge, behavior, our relationships. I think that's what we mean when we talk about our true selves. And so the masks that we wear and the stuff that we bury down deep inside us and the status that we try to promote about ourselves and the lifestyles we chase for this version of ourselves that we think we are, that's so disintegrating. And that's really unhealthy, and spiritually, emotionally, physically, even. And so I think we need to ask these questions, and within this naked self, what are you striving for? What does that reveal about what you value? What story do you tell yourself about who God is and what he wants from you? And, when have you experienced the love of God or felt his nearness? Because when you do feel God's face shining upon you, whether it's from the face of another, whether it's from a touching service, whether it's in a prayer time or, in nature, something really opens up, something cracks open in you then.
One of the other things you point out there is finding marks of his glory in our wounds. So there's a real connection between the interview we did with you last year, The Hope in Our Scars, and this one, Saving Face. So can you speak to that for a moment?
Yeah, this book builds off of the last one. You don't have to read The Hope in Our Scars to read Saving Face, but I really do still continue to build off that work of finding God's glory in our wounds, because, our wounds have a story to tell. And, I don't know about you, but there's been nothing more vulnerable and beautiful. One of the most vulnerable and beautiful things, I should say, is when you are in pain and you share that with another, and they come along and they just stay in the room. They stay in the room with you, and they bear witness to your pain. There's something so powerful about that. And I found that Christ is really hiding out in our wounds. He is there. Think of what he has done for us in the crucifixion and then the resurrection. He went down to the pit. He was in the darkness. And so I feel like that's where church even is so often, is in that, what I call, in The Hope in Our Scars, I call it the underground. It's where you do start, like that grain of wheat that falls to the ground and dies. You die to all these things I was just talking about that you thought you had to be. And you fall down to the underground, and you look to the left and you look to the right, and guess what? You find others who are doing the same thing. And we see each other's pain, but we also see each other's glory then in being able to embrace that naked self and see ourselves as Christ sees us, and then to grow and imagine what he is doing in us now together.
Let's, if we can, take a break, and then we'll come back and finish off. We've talked about the reflected face and the fractured face, the blessed face, even the naked face. But when we can return, maybe we can focus a little bit of time and attention on the maturing face. All part of this book, Saving Face. It, again, is published by Zondervan, is written by Aimee Byrd. And if you'd like to know more about her other books, resources, all sorts of things that we can make available to you, we have all the links necessary to her webpage, to her social media, and to her book as well. So we're going to take a break, and we'll come back and finish off that last section in her book. And if you would like to read it or find out more, we encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for just a few more minutes with Aimee Byrd as we talk about her book, Saving Face. This last section, The Maturing Face, really focuses on the legacy of our faces. But, Aimee, you begin with sort of a delightful conversation and discussion about your grandma, which I thought was interesting because she wants you to be practical. And nothing strikes some people that grew up during the Great Depression as less practical as to be a writer. But speak to that because it then kind of brings into some of you will call the final benedictions. Can you explain that for us?
Yeah, so my dear grandma had high hopes for me to be a dental hygienist. And so she would, just slip that in conversation when I was a kid all the time, like, oh, so-and-so's, daughter became a dental hygienist, and she makes good money, and she loves her job. And, I mean, that sounded horrifying to me. And I also,
with apologies to dental hygienists. Yeah.
No, I very much appreciate them.
Yes.
But I also think of, just how she was brought up in the
right.
stereotypes. She had this little bit of feminism in her, right? Like, get a job and be a dental hygienist. But she would never think like dentist for me either. So, that was kind of curious to me. But, so when I became a writer, I got the feeling that, that just wasn't really in a category for her that she would be proud of. She wouldn't say it, but I would feel it, And she died from colon cancer in old age, and I was able to go visit her a bunch when she was in her last couple weeks of life in the nursing home. And after one of my visits during the end of her life, I was walking away, and she was just a spunky lady, and she sat up, and she's only a little 4'10" maybe, and she said, Aimee, and I had already was almost walking out the door, and I turned around, and I'm like, what, Grandma? And she said, you keep writing. Don't you let them stop you from writing. And I thought, what in the world? Because, it felt good in one sense. Like I took it at the time as, well, wow, Grandma finally accepts what I'm doing. And like, she can die having told me that, she's proud of me in that sense.
Yes.
But, a year later, I really came under a lot of harassment from leaders in my denomination trying to stop me from writing, trying to take down my whole blog and website. And any way I had a voice, they were calling ahead of my speaking engagements, and literally working to sabotage my Amazon reviews and everything. So, quite literally, she blessed me to keep going, that there is going to be a time when someone tries to get me to stop, but don't stop. And it was so empowering to me. So yeah, I just felt like, I go in the book throughout some of the patriarch blessings on their deathbed.
Sure.
And here was the matriarch of our family, my grandma, who just gave me quite a blessing.
And I might just read one or two of them there because you talk about there's a lot of weight given to the deathbed blessings of patriarchs in the Old Testament. And we can think of Rebekah and Jacob scheming to fool Isaac. And you have Joseph dies and gathers his brothers and prophecies that God is not absent in their darkness. You go through quite a few of those. And then, of course, you even in the New Testament have Mary visiting Elizabeth. So some of those are deathbed. Some of those are other kinds of blessings.
Right.
But those are all important. And of course, a good friend of mine, John Trent, wrote The Blessing years ago, and that is certainly something that's biblical and certainly something that Christians have written about. But it's a part of this. And when you talk about this idea of legacy of our faces, we should think about that in terms of legacy, shouldn't we?
Absolutely. And it's really transformed. Writing that book has transformed the way I parent in a lot of ways, too, because, I don't just want to give a deathbed blessing. If you ever have the opportunity, you don't even know. But the blessing that you will light up when your child, mine are young adults now, enter a room. That it is good that you are here. I'm so glad to see you. It blesses me that you are here, and I want to be a blessing to you. Like, you could say so much of that through just body language. And boy, do our right brains read that body language. But also in how we speak to one another, because I also very much remember how it felt when Grandma would, slip in those comments. It didn't feel very good, Like I wasn't living up. Like I didn't fit the mold of what her granddaughter should do. And that's really sad. I'm so glad that she had a chance to correct that and, the power that came with that blessing. But at the same time, how many times can we just spread these blessings like seeds and water on them and blow, to change metaphors, blow into the embers of our children and our friends and our spouses and, to help them be glorified.
And again, finally, to be face to face with Jesus. You end a chapter there by talking about the daughter of Asher, Anna, face to face with Jesus, and whether that is a quote that you want to take from Luke chapter 2, which, of course, many of us are looking at this time of year, or some of the others. That's really the ultimate goal, because we're talking about seeing him face to face someday, and the fact that we can even imagine the face of Jesus helps us understand the importance of the incarnation and how God stepped out of time into eternity, out of eternity into time, I guess I should say. And that is certainly why you wrote this book.
Yes, amen. Thank you for summing it up that way.
And again, any other things that maybe we might pass on, because we do have a link to your website, and if people want to get a copy of the book, that is fine, but maybe they would like to correspond with you. Maybe they would like to begin a conversation with you. Maybe they'd like to follow the writing that you're doing. There are all sorts of ways on your website for people to connect up with you. So how can they do so?
Yeah, AimeeByrd.com will also give you links to my Substack, Bird in Your Box, which I update every couple of weeks, and it's gotten a lot more contemplative these days, and this book is definitely a more contemplative book. And I really just want to leave with that message. There's an invitation at the end of the book, let me see your face.
Yes.
And I just, want to leave with that question of how are you telling your story? What conversation is taking place deep inside between you and God, and what face is forming. And I just think there's so much to dig out there in each one of us, and that we can do that for one another.
Again, let me see your face. How are you telling your story? What conversation is taking place deep inside between you and God? What face is forming? And again, I commend the book too. It's published by our good friends at Zondervan. It's a Zondervan Reflective, Saving Face. And Aimee Byrd, thank you for joining us again here on Point of View.
It's been such a pleasure, Kerby. Thanks for having me.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, guess what? We do have a few things in the news to talk about. Matter of fact, I was not going to even talk about what's going on in the House of Representatives. And then Steve, my producer, came in and said, well, we're going to talk about that. I go, yes, I guess we are. Of course, we were going to talk about what the Republican alternative was, but now they've forced a vote. And so I'll try to explain what's going on right now. If indeed the vote doesn't take place till Friday, we'll certainly have the expertise that will come from Jeff Mateer, as well as from certainly Merrill Matthews, but I suspect some of those votes might be taking place even as soon as today, so we'll get into that as well. So if you find yourself saying, okay, there's just a lot going on, you guess? I mean, we jokingly said that a couple of decades ago, during the December months, we do stuff on the theology of Christmas carols, although I will have a few of those coming out in my commentary. We might even think of doing a Point of View, a home and garden show, because everything shuts down. We're having a major vote happening this week in Congress before they go on recess, and there are Supreme Court decisions being decided. And of course, there have been attacks on Jewish people, not only in Australia, but even in New York City. So we have a lot to cover in this next hour. We'll try to cover as much as we can right after these important messages.
Do not miss the fact that this is an exciting time in America. Record numbers of Gen Z returning to church, reading the Bible. God is clearly moving. But it's also a critical time. Without trustworthy biblical guidance, without spiritual mentors willing to disciple, those young people full of zeal today could be led astray tomorrow. And that's why I urge you to partner with Point of View and equip the mentors the next generation needs. When you support Point of View, you provide a wealth of resources to equip Americans to think biblically about every issue relevant to life today. Your support could supply the tools that someone needs to apply biblical truth in discipleship. So partner with us today, and your gift will be doubled through December 31st. So give today at pointofview.net. Or you can call us 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend some time looking at some of the issues in the news, and one that was kind of forced onto us and forced onto the Speaker of the House has to do with a vote that will take place in due course in the House of Representatives about these enhanced subsidies for the Affordable Care Act, oftentimes referred to as Obamacare. Now, first of all, this is something that is pretty rare. As a matter of fact, off air, we were talking about sometimes you hear the word unprecedented. That phrase may be occasionally, that word sometimes is used a little too often, but I think it's probably pretty accurate here, because the forcing of a vote is coming from what is called a discharge petition. That is, there are times when pieces of legislation get stuck in a committee, and the committee head will not get a vote on it or pass it on to the Rules Committee to put it onto the floor. Sometimes you have a Speaker of the House doing that. And in the past, to be quite honest, Nancy Pelosi did it frequently. I don't know that there's ever been a time when Mike Johnson has done it, but nevertheless, this is one of those. And he had objections to this idea of bringing about a vote. Why? Because we're in the waning hours of the legislative session in December, but at the same time, the argument being made on the other side is that these enhanced subsidies expire at the end of the year. First of all, we knew these were going to expire even when back in, 2022, was it about? Yeah, something like that. 3 years ago almost, in which they actually extended those. We knew those were coming. It's not like this somehow caught everybody off guard. It's not like people haven't figured this out. Was one of the major reasons why we had the largest and longest shutdown in the history of this republic. That being said, you now have enough Republicans and Democrats, mostly Democrats and 4 Republicans, to get the requisite number of 218 to force a vote. And so this will now give the minority leader, that would be Hakeem Jeffries, the ability to force a vote on the enhanced subsidies. And again, there is, I think, a need to at least acknowledge for a moment that this is a fair amount of political showmanship. Why? Because even if you could get this to pass the House, and I'm not sure that it will, even if you could, it is unlikely that anything will happen because you have very significant objections in the U.S. Senate over trying to come up with a 3-year extension of these enhanced subsidies. And I'll get into some of the details in just a minute, but it, I think, illustrates the fact that the Democrats, and now a few Republicans, want to be able to go on record as showing that these individuals did not approve the enhanced subsidies. Now, again, are there solutions to this? Well, that gets us to our article that we've posted today, because the Republicans have indeed put together some better health care ideas. And don't take my word for it. That was the title given to it by the Wall Street Journal. But nevertheless, what we have right now is an attempt to force a vote. And Mike Johnson, who was on CNBC, said, look, doing an end run around the majority party and around the speaker and around the regular process is not the best way to make law. You think? Because what you are trying to do is force a vote, which will probably fail, use it as an election issue. But if you really want to solve the problem, then you go through what's called regular order. And that is not what is happening here. I might just remind everybody, including all of the Democrats that want to have a vote on this, even some of the Republicans that signed the discharge petition, and many others who probably would rather not get a vote on this, that all of this is happening in a time when we recognize that Obamacare, as we pointed out last Friday, and if we have Merrill Matthews on again on Friday, as we will, and we're still talking about this, we're almost in kind of a death spiral in Obamacare. Why? Because when you go on to Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, you cannot charge people with pre-existing conditions any more than you charge healthy people. It doesn't take long for healthy people to say, wait a minute, I don't want to be in this pool. I'm having to pay more than I would if I went out and got health insurance on my own. So as a result, healthy people keep leaving the pool, and the pool gets sicker and sicker and has more and more need for some kind of financial help to actually keep it afloat. This is not a surprise either. These are things that were being talked about years ago when this was being debated in the first place. But nevertheless, this is where we find ourselves right now. So let me begin real quickly by talking about one of the articles I've posted for you to read, because some people listening to this right now might say, well, you've talked about the problems. Do you have any solutions? Yes, we've given quite a few over the last 2 weeks, but let's get into those a little bit more. And this comes from the editors of the Wall Street Journal, who said Democrats think they have Republicans on the run on health care, but maybe not if the Republicans fight back. On Friday, the House Speaker Mike Johnson offered a better alternative to the Democratic proposal to extend these pandemic-era subsidies for Obamacare, and that is to expand insurance choices for employers and their workers. And then they jokingly say, how dare he? House Republicans plan to vote on their bill next week. So I think we're going to have two votes. One on whether or not we will pass these enhanced subsidies for an additional 3 years, and two, to vote on whether or not this particular Republican proposal makes more sense, because we recognize, as I pointed out just a minute ago, December 31st, which is just, was it a week from tomorrow, or 2 weeks from tomorrow, I guess I should say, we're going to actually have these run out. A week from tomorrow, of course, Christmas, but then we have, of course, running out there as well. So, first of all, the focus that they mentioned is that these subsidies were actually added in 2021. I said 2022 is 2021, in which this was, at the time, argued that we needed to have these enhanced subsidies because some people might have lost insurance coverage during the pandemic. Well, that was, if you do your math right, 4 years, almost 5 years ago by the time you get into 2026. And so we can see that there is a problem in that the justification for during the pandemic no longer exists. So the justification now is, well, we don't want people to lose their health care insurance, and we don't want people to be having some kind of sticker shock as a result. So I think it does require a vote, an up or down vote on the Republican option, as well as an up or down vote, as we're going to see now, on the issue of enhanced subsidies for the Affordable Care Act. So when we come back, I'm going to spend some more time talking about the proposals that Republicans have put forward. And if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to read it for myself, that is our second article we've posted on our website at pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Glenn Beck has been writing about a coming reset in his books, The Great Reset and Dark Future. Now he's been talking about an economic reset that will trigger a cultural and political reset. He explains that every debt-based system will end in one of three ways. The country will inflate the money so they can pay off the debt. This is what the German Weimar Republic did. This is what Rome did. The second is a hard default that usually leads to political upheaval. This is what Russia did in 1917. This is what Argentina has done numerous times. The third comes usually after a war that leads to a new monetary order. After World War II, we had the Bretton Woods Conference that made the U.S. dollar the reserve currency of the world. Something is different this time. He says Rome collapsed by itself. France collapsed alone. Weimar collapsed by itself. Britain declined while America rose. This time the collapse won't be national or regional, it will be global. All the major nations are sinking in the debt cycle. Why is this happening? Lynn Alden writes about this in Broken Money, and Lawrence Lepard writes about the big print that is coming. The economy is broken because the money is broken. What will be the future? We can gain some insight from billionaire and hedge fund manager Ray Dalio, who has written about the changing world order and how countries go broke. We will likely face turmoil before a new world order arises from the ashes of countries that naively thought that you could keep borrowing your way to prosperity. This is a time for Christians to point the way to sound financial and biblical principles. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view on chemical abortion, go to viewpoints.info/chemical-abortion. Viewpoints.info/chemical-abortion. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again this weekend, talk about the Republican solution. And they have already talked about a couple of issues, and I will add one more that we've talked about with Dr. Merrill Matthews. But if you would like to read this for yourself, because maybe you're having a debate or a discussion with individuals saying, well, health care is very expensive, and I can't believe that they're not going to pass these enhanced subsidies for Obamacare. First of all, it's quite likely that most of the people you're talking to are complaining about their health insurance they get from their employer, because it's a dwindling number of Americans that get their health insurance from Obamacare, but we do have some, and that is something that was the signature issue for Barack Obama, which is maybe explaining why such a fight over this issue when there are significant structural problems with it. But some of you might say, okay, smart guy, I want to hear your answer. What can be done to make this better? Well, the first part of the Republican bill would make it easier for small businesses to escape the regulatory morass. Those are their terms. The bill would expand so-called association health plans that let small employers unite to sponsor group health plans. These plans would reduce premiums by expanding risk pools and giving giving small employers more leverage with insurers. For example, we've talked about this before. You could have an association. It could be Kiwanis. It could be Key Club. It could be maybe your local business groups, maybe even a small business administration in a community. It could be a series of various companies that have all banded together, and thus you could have association health plans. This particular one doesn't talk about the other issue, and that is most of the health plans that you are aware of, with the exception of Obamacare, which is national, are run from the different states. Well, the argument was made and has been made before, why couldn't you purchase health plans from across state lines? That would change some things very dramatically. And also, they point on that these plans wouldn't have to adhere to many of the costly Obamacare rules. They still couldn't charge more for workers with pre-existing health conditions, but worker premiums for these association plans would be lower than for the Obamacare plans. Workers would also see an increase in take-home pay if their employer's insurance costs were to fall. So there would be some incentives. I've talked about this before. We don't really have a true free market when government has taken over more and more of the issue of health care. And of course, some of that is through Medicaid, some through Medicare, and of course, some of it through Obamacare. So you can begin to see that this isn't exactly a place where competition, which could lower prices and increase services, actually takes place. Then the editors of the Wall Street Journal go on to say that association plans won't work for all small businesses, but the Republican bill also offers another plan, and that is health reimbursement arrangements. These would let employers make tax-free payments for employers to buy their own health insurance in lieu of sponsoring a group plan. Employees would be allowed to buy their own insurance with pre-tax dollars, which would reduce their costs. As I've said before, when I can go out into the market on my own and I have my dollars to begin to purchase a health care plan, I am going to be a lot more conscious of the costs and the benefits, and I might be able to pick a plan that has maybe a very high deductible because I can cover some of the incidental costs, and it would cost me a lot less, and I might be able to save myself money and save it in ways that my employer could not. So that is the case. They also point out some of the problems with what we have right now because the Obamacare subsidies are pegged to premiums for silver plans, and the cost-sharing mandate has resulted in larger subsidies for all the plans. They say a better solution would be to eliminate the cost-sharing mandate, which can make Obamacare plans more attractive than employer plans for lower income enrollees. And they say this is one of the reasons why the share of workers in employer medical plans among those with access to them, the so-called take-up rate has fallen from 6 to 65% from 73%. And so there are all sorts of things that can be done. One other one that's not mentioned in this, but of course that is something that is being proposed, is to vastly increase the medical savings account. These call them health savings account, now they call them medical savings account. And as I said before, when I put the money in your account and you can go out and make choices about which health care plan you want to pick, but also what health care dollars you want to spend, there's going to be comparison shopping. And I probably won't use the example of taking everybody out to dinner because everybody wanted to know when I'm taking everybody out on the point of view credit card last time. But nevertheless, that was one of those ideas that if you go out to a restaurant and somebody else is paying for it, you're not paying that much attention to the price. And that's the problem with a lot of health care. You don't pay for it. You don't even know what it costs. Oftentimes the doctor doesn't know what it costs. The hospital only lets you know at the end after they've already billed the insurance company and you find out what your copay is. And transparency is helpful, but it's not enough. You have to actually be able to use the transparency factor in choosing wise ideas and wise programs It can be on everything from the insurance you purchase to the doctors you go to the pharmaceuticals you pick. And those all, I think, are part of the solution. And right now, of course, those are not going to be the conversations that'll be taking place over the next couple of days in the House of Representatives. But we'll probably come back to it perhaps as recently or as soon as tomorrow. Certainly on Friday, I suspect we'll be talking about it quite a bit with Dr. Merrill Matthews and others, because this is a big issue and it's kind of the issue of the moment. But just before we take a break, in some respects, my commentary today really fits, because all of this conversation is taking place. How much more is the federal government going to subsidize health care at a time when the federal government is, I hate to break it to you, broke? The federal government's not just broke, it's $38 trillion past broke. And my commentary today is where I'm quoting Glenn Beck, in which he has been talking about reset. Now, if you've read some of his books, and I've read some of them, like The Dark Future, and I've read I've read that cover to cover. I've read most of The Great Reset, although I skipped some parts because I already knew all of that. And he's been talking about the cultural and political reset, but now he's talking about an economic reset. And he just points out that when you are dealing with a debt-based system, and that's what we have right now in the United States, we are facing some very significant issues. And he spends some time pointing out the fact that every debt-based system ends in one of three ways. Either the country will inflate the money so it can pay off the debt. That's what the German Weimar Republic did. That's what Rome did. The second is a hard default, which leads to a tremendous amount of political upheaval. That's what Russia did in 1917. That's what Argentina's done a couple of times. And the third is what, of course, usually happens after a war and a complete reset, and that's what happened after World War II in the Bretton Woods Conference, in which that made the United States the reserve currency of the world. But the bottom line is, right now, we are facing some significant debt. My guess is, as I point out in my commentary, we're going to take the first option, and that is to inflate the money. And that's why I quote from Lynn Alden's book, Broken Money, and also from Lawrence Lepard's book, The Big Print, which are coming. And if you are not familiar with those books, certainly you can go into any Barnes & Noble or bookstore right now and see some books by Ray Dalio, The Changing World Order, and his most famous book right now, How Countries Go Broke. So whether it's Glenn Beck, whether it's Lawrence Lepard, whether it's Lynn Alden, whether it is Ray Dalio, or whether it's Kerby Anderson, we're talking about the fact that we are in a debt-based system, and there is a lot of evidence that something very significant, maybe even catastrophic, is on the horizon. And it does seem to me that at a time when we need to do what we can to maybe constrain costs and not spend more, we have individuals, as I pointed out just the other day, that we're willing to shut down the federal government for a longer period than any time in history so that the federal government would spend more money on a health care plan that doesn't seem to be working for most Americans. That is something I think, as we get into issues of affordability in the 2026 midterm elections, you need to keep in mind as well. But let's take a break. It's about time to come back and talk about what's happening to our Jewish friends, not only in Australia, but even in New York City. We'll be right back.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. You know, that scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour today. Let me just mention tomorrow we're going to be talking with Mike Broyles about the Malachi Dads and a ministry there in the prisons. We'll also be talking with our good friend Ray Comfort. Got a new book out, which of course gets us into issues like evangelism and much more. And we'll cover some more of these other stories. But before this hour ran out, I did want to talk a little more about Australia. It is our first article. Richard Lowry says that the attack there in Australia was shocking, but not all that surprising. He says these events follow the same pattern because of the fundamentalist version of Islam is at its root basically hostile to Jews. And he uses a good illustration, which maybe we should use in maybe future presentations. Let's say there's a refugee flow of Unitarians, and some portion of those Unitarians were antagonistic to traditional Christians since they had vandalized their businesses, harassed them in the streets, launched massive protests in favor of overseas Unitarian terror groups. In this case, we'd obviously cast a skeptical eye on Unitarian immigration. Yet, he says that hasn't been true of Muslim immigration. Mainstream political parties across the West that have championed this open-handed policy are understandably losing ground to restrictionist parties that are more clear-eyed about the realities of immigration. And he points out, look, anti-Semitism comes in all sorts of varieties, whether Christian, Muslim, or secular. Still, it'd startle us to learn that someone attending a fundamentalist Christian church went and shut up a Jewish event, where it's not that unusual if an adherent of fundamentalist Islam is. And he says, look, there are different interpretations of Islam. It's not the role of him as an outsider to figure out what is correct. But he can then go on to say, let's now look at the evidence. And I would encourage you to read this 3-page article because he brings some things to the table, which Brigitte Gabriel and a few others have brought to our conversation. But it's been a while. And he reminds us that, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas, the Palestinian branch, and others are all markedly anti-Semitic. One analyst has noted the anti-Jewish agitation includes boycotts, graffiti, and physical violence. He then takes us to the original Hamas charter. And I like his line here, reads like a transcript of Candace Owens' podcast, except with an arm wing attached. And I'd never read some of the Hamas charter before, although we've had some guests on here that have gotten into that. And according to this, that's why I use Candace Owens, the Jews are responsible for the French Revolution. The Jews are responsible for the Bolshevik Revolution. The Jews have founded secret societies such as the Freemasons, the Rotary Clubs, and Lions. This is in the Hamas charter. I had no idea. And it's just a real reminder of just all that is actually being promoted in various communities, for example, even in Gaza by Hamas. And then, of course, talks about some of the things that you can read in the Quran. I don't recommend it for your daily quiet time or something of that nature, but if you go to Surah 9, that'd be the 9th chapter in the Quran. And by the way, the Quran is not written in chronological order. The Bible is sort of written in chronological order. Maybe Job comes before some of the passages and a few things like that. But basically, it's chronologically. Actually, the shorter and longer ones are kind of matched together. So Surah 9 really takes place late after, of course, Muhammad has declared war on various groups. And you can read, for example, the day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews, meaning killing the Jews, when the Jews will hide behind stones and trees. The stones and trees will say, "O Muslim, O Abdal, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him." And he gives you a couple of the quotes, and you, of course, Surah 9:6 and other 9:5 and 6 are passages we've used before. Don't need to go into those. It's well known, but it's oftentimes forgotten. And so when we see these things taking place, we need to speak out against anti-Semitism. Now, you heard me say, well, not only is this happening in Australia, it's happening in New York City. The reason I say that is now we have police looking for a man who has stabbed a Jewish man in the chest. He comes up to this 35-year-old Jewish individual and begins to make some anti-Jewish statements and then proceeds to stab him in the chest. Now, this is a place in New York City, Sterling Place and Albany Avenue, not exactly a place where you'd expect there to be an assault on a Jewish citizen. And this is why you've had Jewish members and citizens and people living in New York City saying, we don't even feel safe on the streets anymore. And it's just one more illustration of why we should certainly be concerned about anti-Semitism. These words have consequences. Sometimes the words lead to those consequences, and that's certainly why I think we should address those issues. One last piece I thought I would mention real quickly, and then we'll get into some of the things about the statements by the president, Donald Trump, and even the statements by his chief of staff, which we'll get into in just a minute. But I also posted a piece by Michael Brendan Doherty because I thought it would be very helpful. They're starting to talk about what you call the iPhone conservatism. That is, well, we don't necessarily want to think that the 1950s and 60s were better than the 2020s, if for no other reason, because we have an iPhone. And you have this interesting back and forth, which I'll encourage you to read, between David French, who's been on the program, and Matt Walsh, who's been on the program. I always hate it when individuals who probably share a lot in common interact with each other, disagree with one another, make fun of one another. But nevertheless, Michael Brendan Doherty thought he would step in there. And first of all, starts out by saying, the problem with his teenagers, and they're not even teenagers yet, is they are show such a lack of gratitude for the modern marvels that they have. And he points out the fact that there have been some people that have on one side said, well, it was much better in the 1950s and 60s because you could actually support a family on a single income. You could buy a home. You could even have enough money to send your kids to college. Now, two people are working. They're up to debt. They can't buy a house, and they're coming down with $250,000 or more of debt. And so wasn't it nice back in the 1950s? Well, then you have others saying, oh, come on, look at all the modern advances that we have today. We have, of course, the iPhone, and we have all sorts of wonderful advances. And quite frankly, people live in larger homes today. They have more choices in the economy. And this is a good example where when I see a battle between David French and Matt Walsh, I go, I think they're both right, once you understand how to think that through. Because the point Michael Brendan Doherty is saying, yes, some advances make life better in some ways, but our perception doesn't experience these benefits in an objective way. Nobody in 1985, he says, felt an acute lack or deprivation of having the applications for food delivery, driving directions, and even rudimentary large language models on cell phones. We didn't have cell phones back in the the 1980s, and nobody felt deprived. My iPhone here is certainly something that provides me with advantages, maybe some security, but it's sort of not that big a deal. And if that's going to be, well, just look, you've got the iPhone now, that is the case. David French criticizing Matt Walsh for talking about the fact that in some respects we did better in the 1950s because you could buy a starter home. But at the same time, yes, that starter home probably lacked central air, modern utilities, but violent crime might have been lower in some of those situations. And so there's a real sort of, if you will, back and forth about this. And Michael Brendan Doherty points out at the end, look, we also have some other factors that say it was better back then. American men today are less fit, less likely to be married, less likely to have children, less likely to own a home, more likely to be addicted to a drug, more likely to be mired in a medical disability than they were in the 1950s, the 1970s, or even the 1990s. So I think you have to figure out which particular issues you pick, which particular issues you focus on. And in some respects, a lot of this is going to be relevant in 2026 in the midterm elections. If you say, well, we certainly don't have this kind of economic benefits that we had before, and I'm really having difficulty paying for my bills, that affordability issue is going to be a major election issue. If, on the other hand, you point out that in some respects we have some very significant benefits now, maybe affordability won't be as big an issue. As we oftentimes say, perception for many people becomes reality, especially in the elections. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's, if we can, focus on a couple of other very important issues. And one of those, which we've sort of held off talking about, is the critical remarks that the president has made about Rob Reiner. And I love what one editorial comment said: the President of the United States does not need to weigh in on every murder in this country, even the shocking double murder involving a celebrity. The President has the option of writing nothing and raging about Reiner's alleged past transgressions privately, but that's, of course, not what he has done. And the question that I'm starting to see people raise, and Jim Garrity being one of those, is, does this not show some other issues that are beginning to be concerning about the president? We, of course, have raised questions in the past about Joe Biden, and I think it's appropriate to start raising some questions about Donald Trump, because he seems to be obsessed, as Jim Garrity points out, with grievances, vindictive sometimes, all sorts of tirades on social media. And this, again, we might remind everybody, is a person that runs the executive branch of the United States, and so is something that should be of concern. Now, I think it's interesting that Nate Jackson, I'll quote from another person, said, you know, we certainly would have to say, is it too much to ask that when a man and his wife are murdered by their son, the President of the United States refrains from making ugly statements about the deceased? But Nate Jackson goes on to say, maybe all the leftists who celebrated Charlie Kirk's murder or Rush Limbaugh's death from cancer should sit this one out. So I think the point is that those who are now fainting from some of the things the president has said, maybe you're just a tad bit hypocritical about that. But at the same time, I think the rest of us can say, Mr. President, this was just bad form. And I have noticed, and I'm sure you've noticed as well, that a lot of people that have appreciated Donald Trump, have appreciated his policies, have said this was beyond the pale, and is a concern about the fact that sometimes he can't seem to let something go, and does many times cause people to wonder if indeed the fact that we were concerned about Joe Biden having too little energy, maybe Donald Trump has too much energy, and it manifests itself in some ways that are not fitting for the President of the United States. That story is one that we could devote an entire hour to, but it seems to me to bring us to another story that has just broken spoken, and that is the fact that for those of you that read Vanity Fair, you also have a very long and detailed profile piece on the White House, which comes via the Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles. Now, I've seen some people refer to her as the second most powerful person in the land. That may be overstated a little bit, but to recognize that a Chief of Staff really can determine who has access to the president and what kind of decisions need to be made in the Oval Office, as illustrated by the fact that if you've watched many of the trips that the president has taken in recent memory, almost always Susie Wiles, who is, of course, a female. Oftentimes you're not used to seeing females in some of these particular venues, as a Chief of Staff has been there. And so she is an individual that has certainly had access like no other to some of the things taking place in the Oval Office. And so this has turned out to be a rather blunt and maybe even an unflattering assessment of some of the people that serve Donald Trump. Matter of fact, she denied making one of the remarks about this. She said in an interview with the Times on Monday, Susie Wiles took issue with a quote attributed to her about the drug use. I'm pretty sure that had to do with the drug use of Elon Musk. Said, "That's ridiculous. I wouldn't have said it. I wouldn't know." Well, then, Mr. Whipple, who's the one that did the interview, actually played a tape for the Times in which she could be heard saying that. So this is not good form either. If you said it, own up to it. If you didn't say it, okay, push the envelope. And then, of course, the article that she is referring to, she said, published earlier this morning, is disingenuously framing as a hit piece on me and the finest president, the White House staff, and cabinet in history. Significant context was disregarded, and much of what I and others said about the team and the president was left out of the story. I assume after reading it, this was done to paint an overwhelmingly chaotic and negative narrative about the president and our team. The truth is the Trump White House has already accomplished more in 11 months than any other president has accomplished in 8 years, and that is due to the unmatched leadership and vision of President Trump, for whom I've been honored to work for the better part of a decade. None of this will stop our relentless pursuit of making America great again. So that's her phrase. I want you to hear her side of it. And certainly you can read Vanity Fair and read Mr. Whipple's pulling that together. But what is so intriguing about this is, as at least one person has pointed out, you remember the old phrase, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. How about fool me 11 times? And I think that's exactly what you have, because apparently there were 11 interviews here, and it seems to me that then when you see, as they have shown, a picture of these individuals all around the table being photographed, this is certainly one illustration of the fact that they had probably very significant access to the White House. Now, there have been some that have rolled their eyes and said, this is amazing that Susie Wiles has done this. Maybe she's only going to be there for a short period of time. There are many others that have said, this just is exactly what the Trump administration's all about. How many times can you count, even on more than one hand, in which Joe Biden in the Oval Office took questions from the press? Donald Trump takes questions from the press every single day. And as a result, there is a level of transparency that probably we will never see again, because there are certainly all sorts of people and political consultants that want to keep anybody out of the public eye and want to try to craft their message. And of course, as we've just pointed out, President Trump is quite willing to say some things bluntly when the microphones are on, or very bluntly on his social media post and all of that. And so it's not surprising that you would certainly get a perspective on some of this about some of those individuals that were working there. And this led to, I think, the final comment I will make today, and that is J.D. Vance was asked about this idea that Susie Wiles says that sometimes J.D. Vance believes in conspiracy theories. And the vice president, J.D. Vance, said, I only believe in conspiracy theories that are true. I believe in the crazy conspiracy theory back in 2020 that it was stupid to mask 3-year-olds at the height of the COVID pandemic. I believed in the crazy conspiracy theory that the media and the government were covering up the fact that Joe Biden was clearly unable to do the job. And I believed in the conspiracy theory that Joe Biden was trying to throw his political opponents in jail rather than win an argument against his political opponents. So at least on some of these conspiracy theories, it turns out that a conspiracy is just something that was true 6 months before the media finally admitted it. So we'll certainly spend a little bit more time talking about the Vanity Fair article and all the others, but I did thought you might want to read it, come to your own conclusions. But if you wanted a transparent White House, that's what you've got. All the successes and the warts for everybody to perceive. That's all we have for today. I look forward to our conversation tomorrow. I want to thank Megan and Steve for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Do not miss the fact that this is an exciting time in America. Record numbers of Gen Z returning to church, reading the Bible. God is clearly moving. But it's also a critical time. Without trustworthy biblical guidance, without spiritual mentors willing to disciple, those young people full of zeal today could be led astray tomorrow. And that's why I urge you to partner with Point of View and equip the mentors the next generation needs. When you support Point of View, you provide a wealth of resources to equip Americans to think biblically about every issue relevant to life today. Your support could supply the tools that someone needs to apply biblical truth in discipleship. So partner with us today, and your gift will be doubled through December 31st. So give today at pointofview.net, or you can call us 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.